What is grief inspired anyways? Why did I create it? And what does it all mean? My name is Catherine McNulty and I created Grief Inspired. And I want to share with you a little bit more about what Grief Inspired is, what it means, why I created the name, and what it can mean for you. My name is Catherine McNulty and this is Grief Inspired. So what is Grief Inspired? Well, first, Grief Inspired is my mission, my attempt to bring light to the darkness of your grief. It is to give you tools and education to help you heal from the pain of grief that you're experiencing. And it's a encouragement to help you create a life that's inspired by your loss now that your loved one is gone. And we're going to dive into each one of those three things and talk a little bit more about what each of them means. So I chose the word grief, obviously, because we are all grieving. If you are here, it's because you know what grief is. And for me, early on, grief was miserable. The experience of grief was depressing, was overwhelming, was confusing, was frustrating, all of the emotions that I know that you likely are going through, right? I had my period of being in shock. I was surprised by the fact that no one wanted to talk to you about your grief. I was surprised that people got tired of hearing about what was going on, that it was lonely, that even though in a world where everyone ultimately dies, nobody really knows how to deal with it. So grief was obviously an important word, but the inspiration comes from not knowing originally for myself that there was inspiration after loss, that you could get through it, that not only could you get through it, not only could you survive it, but that it could be fuel to create something new in your life, something that would make it all have meaning, something that would make sense of it all and give you purpose for how you can live your life moving forward without your loved one. And so it's this shift from moving from survival to just surviving to creation, to creating something new. And so that's where the inspiration comes. But let's break it down. So first I say it's to shine light on the darkness of grief. As you know, grief is heavy, grief is dark. But shining light on it means fully acknowledging the impact of your grief, that acknowledging that this is a big deal, that if you're here and you're watching these videos, right, you're looking for answers. And so what I want to encourage you to do is continue leaning into that, to not avoid grief and to not try to do it on your own. Because society's kind of set up for that. Society is set up for you going into your house, staying there for, they say what, a couple of weeks, and then coming out and being miraculously better so that you don't have to talk about this grief stuff anymore. And I joke like, ugh, you've got that grief hanging around you. I don't want to catch that, right? I don't want to catch that. Like, don't let any of that grief stuff get on me. And that's not a good place to be. And so I want to be the voice for you to say, like, that's not how it's supposed to be. And that, yes, grief is heavy and dark and uncomfortable and challenging. And it's a struggle. But shining light on the darkness of grief is encouraging you to lean into it with the knowledge that it's not going to be like this forever. And it's shining light on it so that you know that you can try to avoid it. I did for 2 years, but it's going to come up again. If the person that you've lost is really important to you, if you're here, if you're feeling significant pain of loss, it's going to come back up because it's something that you have to process. It's something that we have to walk through. And so by me bringing light to the darkness of grief, it's so that you don't have to walk through it alone the way I did. So I want to do that for you. So that's the first component, is to shine light on the darkness of grief. And I'm so glad that you're here. Secondly, is to provide you education and tools that are required to heal the pain of grief. Well, what does that mean? What it means is that there are things that I didn't know, things that I learned, things that the way I had to shift my way of thinking, the way I had to shift my perspective from being a victim of grief to saying, like, this is normal. This is the process. How can I get out of it? I was somebody who I knew what education was. I have a graduate degree. I knew how to educate myself. And what I learned in my own grief is that education can be a key to a lot of healing. You know, they say knowledge is power, right? We've heard that depending on how old you are in our cartoons when we were kids. Knowledge is power. And so I can give you the education, and then I can give you tools. Well, how can I release guilt? How can I discharge anger? If you saw my video where I beat the crap out of a pillow, that's a healthy way to let it go, right? How can I reframe my guilt and lean into love and forgiveness and grace? Those are tools that you can use. How do you surrender to what is? Those are tools that I go and I've gone and I've learned because I knew I needed them. And now I want to share them with you because they exist and you need to know. So there is an education. Education is super important when it comes to healing grief. And, you know, the other thing I want to point out is that therapy is important, but there's so much around personal growth that has to happen in order for us to effectively heal, that therapy and personal development need to come together. And there's so many therapists that are amazing, amazing. But the education for those who go to school to become therapists to help through grief, it doesn't include personal development. So for me, I've dove into personal development and realized that it's helped my healing. And I've done a lot of therapy, and that has helped my healing. And so bringing those together and sharing with you what I've learned is going to help you too. You're going to learn about your grief, right? You need to educate yourself on your grief, and you need to educate yourself about who you are. There is no doubt with every person that I've ever talked to that grief creates significant change in our lives. When that much change happens in our lives, it changes us. So when so many people say, I've lost my sense of self, I don't know who I am. Yes, it's true. You may have lost your sense of self, but there's an opportunity to gain it, to become closer and to understand how your grief and the pain of grief and the experience of grief and the grief journey and the process can help you to grow and figure out what that all means. And then finally, GriefInspired is to have the belief that not only can you get through grief, that you can survive the grief And with my education and tools, maybe do it a little bit faster or a lot faster than if you had done it on your own. But it's also to encourage you to believe that you are fundamentally different because of your loss, because of your experience, and that's not a bad thing. And that there is an unfolding and an awakening that happens as part of our grief. You know, I talk all the time about Rumi's quote that the wound is the place where the light entered. When you are wounded by grief, light can enter. And it can change who you are. It can change your life, but it can also change it in a good way and give you an opportunity to say, where is there meaning? Where can I find meaning? You know, I had a client who's super upset that when she was at the funeral home going through the process, right? How many people still say horrible things. They're trying to say nice things, but they say all the things that really aren't helpful. And she's like, I want to create a physical flyer to share at funeral homes so that the instant people have to deal with someone else who's grieving, they have tools. And I'm like, it's amazing. That is grief inspired. But she sure as hell wouldn't want to be doing that if she didn't understand the magnitude of loss, if it didn't change who she was fundamentally as a person, if she wasn't struggling to find her way now that her loved one is gone. All of these things are critically important, right? And being inspired by our loss means creating something new, and it's inspired by the love that you have for them, and it's by carrying that love in your heart and creating something out of that love, right? I have amazing friends who I've gotten to know who create podcasts after their loss to share more about grief. There are people who go into healing because they want to heal people from grief. Maybe it's to become a therapist. Maybe it's to become a coach. Maybe it's to become a speaker to talk about the magnitude of grief. And it doesn't always have to be all about grief. Maybe it's about the illness that they went through and suffer, and creating awareness so that people understand that loss happens. And when it's looking at things like COVID, where sometimes there were things that we could do to prevent it or understand the magnitude of it and how it affects the elderly, how it affects people who are immune compromised. These things are all important. And so it's taking what you have and your experience and your pain and sharing it in ways with the world, sharing it to help others, to connect to others, to create awareness. Whatever those things are, all of that is grief inspired. So is there a definition of exactly what grief inspired needs to be? No. But grief inspired is if you change and if you create something and you give back to anyone in the world. Maybe it's just being slightly more compassionate with someone who has now lost someone too. And using in your heart, knowing the pain that you went through and saying, I know that pain too. I know the pain of grief. Just collectively us sharing and saying, I know that pain too. That's grief inspired. That's what it's all about. And that's why we feel the pain. And that's why we go through the process. And that's why we watch videos and we take courses and we learn and we read and we struggle with our faith. And we ask God why this happens. And we figure it out with ourselves and with others. And then we help other people through it. or we become better versions of ourselves, the people we were intended to be, because we can drop all the pretenses and all the bullshit, because you get it, because you know what grief is, you know what loss is, and you know that it's not a joke and that it's an opportunity. And I want you to embrace that opportunity. First, you got to get through it. First, you got to heal. You got to teach yourself. And as you change, something in your life will surface where you become inspired to do something that you otherwise would not be inspired to do. Inspired because of your loss. And because you want to honor yourself, your process, and the people that you're missing. That's what Grief Inspired is. So I hope that that helps you. Let me know what you think. If you have comments, let me know those as well. If there's things I've missed, if there's things that you see needing, let me know. Let's create them together. Maybe you and I can create something that's grief inspired together. You know, I shared in the last video that I wanted you to share stories of the people that you've lost. Sharing those stories so that other people can hear is being grief inspired. So no matter where you are in your journey, you can be grief inspired too. So that's what grief inspired is. It's what I want for you. It's ultimately the inspiration to be happy, the inspiration to connect, the inspiration to become more of who you were supposed to be. That's what Grief Inspired is. So thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for contributing to Grief Inspired. And I clearly need to go to the next meeting. But thank you so much. Thank you for all your sharing, for all your questions. Keep them coming. Let's keep doing this together because you are not alone. We are not alone. We can do this together. Bye for now.